The Certainty Principle by Dave Light, Chapter 12, Big Brain Organ, Section 12.6 through 12.8, talking about brain bandwidth. I call it brain width. So the visual bandwidth is 300 to 780 nanometers. We don't see anything shorter wavelength. We don't see anything longer wavelength. Visual perception in terms of what we can detect, in terms of the strength of electromagnetic radiation, is 1/10,000th to 100,000 lux, and that's a measure of light intensity. We don't see anything brighter than that, and we can't see anything that's darker than that. Our auditory range is 20 to 20,000 hertz. We can't hear anything at a higher frequency or lower frequency. And our auditory limits in terms of decibels is about 5 to 150. 150 is like being behind a jet taking off. So if it gets over that, we're in trouble. If it gets under that, we can't hear it. And our haptic measurement, which is an interesting one, has to do with what we can distinguish in terms of the size of something on a flat surface. It's about 2.3 millimeters. So much shorter than that, we can't detect it with our fingertips. So why am I bringing all this up? Because basically, we are confined in a domain of our ability to transduce. So a transducer is something that detects and sends a signal. We have 5 senses. We're confined within the domain of what those senses can detect, and we don't detect anything else. We're also confined within a domain of our cognitive ability, which is very limited, right? IQ is bracketed between this arbitrary scale we call 0 to 100. 0 is non-existent. 100 is supposed to be about average, about medium. So I've got this plot here. It's kind of a three-dimensional plot. That's all of mankind, basically, is what that represents, normalized to the normal, what the average is. That's where the big bump is in the middle. And the 3 coordinates are our aggregate sensory capacity. That is all that we can take in through our transducers, eyes, ears, taste buds. I left that one out, but that's certainly got a range to it. And then our range of cognition, that is our intellectual ability. And then the vertical axis is population distribution. So, for example, very few people, if any, exist at an aggregate sensory capacity below 10, or at an aggregate intelligence capacity below 10. By the same token, you can see where I have the little bubble there. There are a few people that have very, very high capacities in both sensory perception and intellectual ability. And I would argue sensory perception, intellectual ability, maybe you can do something about, maybe you can't. But in terms of sensory perception, that has a lot to do with how aware you are, how much you're paying attention. Now, arguably, if you're deaf, you're not going to hear something, right? But most experience that goes on for most of us is not degraded because of bad hearing or bad eyesight necessarily. It's we're not paying attention. And TCP is very much focused on, are you paying attention? Are you aware of what's going on around you? So that curve sort of represents a distribution of all capacity to experience, normalized to the average. Of course, there's people that are out on the tail of either of these. And I put that little bubble there. I'm right here. That's the Dunning-Kruger, right? Because most people think they're above average in all things. Not everyone, but most. The average person thinks they're above average. There are measurements of olfactory senses based on the ability to perceive, say, orange flavored jello. Suffice to say that young people have 50 times the olfactory sensitivity of a 70-year-old. Cognition on the IQ scale ranges from vegetative state to about 200, normalized to 100. That means average to 100. All human sensory ranges are narrow when compared to the entire spectrum of available signal. Sure, there's a lot of stuff out there. We don't see it, we don't hear it, we don't taste it, we don't know it. It doesn't exist to us, and you can argue the same thing for our cognitive ability. There's a hell of a lot going on in the universe we have no concept of. We have no ability to conceptualize or create a symbology to define it, although we keep trying, right? And we make progress. All human sensory ranges are narrow when compared to the entire spectrum of available signal. The above graph represents the hill of human experiential capacity. We are all somewhere on the hill. Though we can use tools to improve sensory detection, we cannot materially alter sensory capacity. We are ultimately limited by our ability to read these derivative inputs. All are abstractions of the underlying reality. An infrared photograph shows the infrared wavelengths in, well, red. That is to say, you can't see infrared if you're a human being. So we represent it in a visual range that we can see. Interestingly, if you know anything about X-ray crystallography or reverse Fourier transforms, this is an interesting concept here because basically what we see are the shadows of what goes on. We are, in fact, seeing just a little fringe of the total signal available in the universe. And the reason I use the X-ray crystallography, if you study thermodynamics, what you're getting are just points that can be derived back to indicate what's actually going on in the real world. I won't get into it, but it's an interesting analogy to draw. The fact that we are just getting points. We aren't getting anything like the real signal. All are abstractions of the underlying reality. What is the sound of 30,000 hertz, vibration? No human being knows. Likewise, the brain is a limited computing device. Besides having important recall limitations, its other calibrations of computational capacity are feeble compared to, say, an Intel Core i7 8700K processor. Try installing a new piece of brain software with the ease of, say, Office 365 on a laptop. But even the i7 operates in a binary sorting process of the brain. Is this the only form of cognition possible? Undoubtedly, no. It's just modeled after our form. On or off, yes or no. So why do I maintain such righteous reliance on my own perceptions and computations as the determinant of what is possible? Well, I'll tell you why. Because we exist in a universe of other cognitive human beings operating on approximately the same levels. So for all intents and purposes, we're in a domain constrained by our own limitations in our ability to think and to experience. So if everybody's on that same boat, if everybody's in that same domain, well, what's the big deal of wondering why there's something beyond? Well, because it's humbling. It brings in an element of humility to know that there's vast intelligence, vast signal beyond anything we experience. So why do I maintain such righteous reliance on my own perceptions and computations as a determinant of what is possible? No good reason. I am cognitively constrained just as we are sensorially constrained. As such, it is all the more important that my accurate evaluation of experience is optimized and unencumbered. So here I come back to TCP. Despite these limitations, I allow unbridled vanity. Even a frog thinks he's a god. I hope the metaphor isn't lost on you guys. We think we're gods. A frog thinks he's a god. So check again. Like any CPU, the brain is limited by its clock speed. and by clogging the data pipe with useless signal. There are limit, there is a limited rate at which the brain cycles calculations, and how much data can we reasonably process at a time. Even a computer will stumble with cloggy code. Unlike the computer, though, the brain is subject to physical fatigue, which can diminish its processing capacity to that of a gerbil. At its worst, I experience Velcro moments, getting stuck in stupid, escalating frustration, identity attachment, and in turn accelerating my error rate. Quote, the brain can only do one thing at a time with excellence. I should say the human brain can only do one thing at a time with excellence, unquote. That's Stephen R. Covey, 1989. Stephen R. Covey's statement reflects the limitations of the brain as a CPU. There are limitations to multitasking, particularly when the multitasks are trivial. Abstractions, particularly those connected with repetitive self-inflicted identity attacks, get reinforced by emotional load. Messages such as, my third grade teacher told me I would never amount to anything, unquote, consume bandwidth more than the reason-based problem-solving activities because they don't succumb to the razor of logical reasoning. They don't need to. They're untethered to logic. That's one of the problems with identity. It's not tethered to logic. Logic per se is the great, I want to say anchor, but that's not a good word because it really liberates. Logic liberates. Emotion incarcerates. Emotion makes data indigestible and drives logic errors and judgment failures. It creates, in a word, uncertainty. Logic-intensive games, for example solitaire, where subtle judgment errors spell defeat, are important platforms for testing this hypothesis. My judgment suffers when my brain is preoccupied with self-centered emotional abstractions that consume my capacity for reasoning, i.e., logical decision-making. The greater my preoccupation with emotion-driven, self-centered, abstract identity loops, the greater my uncertainty. RAPS 12.7. The brain as a computational device responds rather inefficiently to reprogramming. Adults always have a suite of software running in various levels of complexity, some whole programs, some apps, some fragments of code, vestiges of former operating systems, or particularly significant inputs caused by one trauma or another. The code runs by necessity or because it was insituated into its own feedback loop. Call it a RAP, repetitive auto-reinforced personification programs. I like that. These are typically reinforced with emotional, hormonal attachments, therefore making thoughtless experience more and more difficult to achieve. RAPs take all forms, but they have one trait in common: reactivity. He's a jerk, she's a genius. Stopping RAPs requires 5 basic steps. 1. Label the RAP. Next time my brain finds itself sliding into a familiar reactive monologue, quick, name the RAP. For example, say the RAP is fat people are lazy and selfish. Each time I see an obese person, I begin spinning my judgmental story on how disgusting I find fat people. The remedy's first step is to name the RAP. Here, the fat RAP is the judgmental, reoccurring story in my head, triggered by encountering someone who is obese. Naming the RAP is the key first step that enables me to call it out instantly the next time. 2. Test the RAP for accuracy. Once I can challenge the justification, once named, I can challenge the justification. Is this RAP simply a reaction to prejudice or rational? Is it accurate that all fat people are disgusting, self-absorbed, and irresponsible, or does the reason suggest otherwise? The answer is no, they are not. I've had good friends and colleagues who are fat. In fact, I've been a little chubby myself at certain points throughout my life. So no, my judgment is inaccurate and must be eliminated. Erase the RAP. If I establish the RAP is logically inaccurate, bad code, I must repair it and erase it so that it doesn't continue loading and running automatically each time it's triggered. Because this RAP defies logic, my brain does understand logic. I must instruct my brain that the fat RAP is inaccurate and I must stop repeating the story. You cannot get mad at yourself for continuing to run RAPs that you have not deleted, that you have not instructed your brain to stop repeating. Since it is important to explicitly decode your brain, it helps to do A written exercise for this process rather than rely on a mental note. Ditch the fat rap and everything will be better. Isn't good enough. You must issue the instruction to your brain to stop using it. Replace the rap. To preempt the fat rap, I substitute a new story that runs every time I see a fat person. The anti-fat rap. Some of the most important people I admire are fat. Churchill was fat. Oprah is fat. I am fat. Perhaps the person I am looking at is like me. Perhaps they are working on a cure for cancer. 5. Abstraction of the rap. The brain tends to abstract rather than experience. It rushes to map sensory experiences from instantaneous into symbols and sounds so that I can classify and quantify them into memory, albeit a pale shadow of the real thing. Consider my compulsion to photograph and post almost every experience on Facebook, a digital extension of brain's need to feed memory. Language and mathematics are most common symbolisms used to represent reality, but there are other methods too. Graphic art, music, sculpture serve a similar function of capturing some essence or interpretation of truth. And generally, the more skilled the artist, the more of what is captured exceeds what is possible to represent through the spoken word. My brain expresses thoughts in words. It is addicted to using them, whether or not words are relevant to the reality being presented through the senses. It is a concept analyzing, abstracting machine that seeks sense from all it encounters. Big mistake. Some things don't make sense. Sense is literally the chain of words I spontaneously create in an effort to fold an experience into pre-existing concepts it has formulated over years. The certainty principle tells us that these rivers of conceptualization can overwhelm our ability to accurately experience reality. So how do we stop it?